Sinha, the founder and editor of Alt News. And I think most of us who have any engagement with democracy know that this is a website which constantly, systematically examines the information that is given out there by news media, by social media, and tells us what to believe and what to disregard, which perhaps is the most important input in any democracy. Welcome, Pratik.
Thank you so much.
Pratik has also written a book along with two co-authors on India Misinformed, the True Story. Along with Pratik, we have a very eminent, internationally very well-regarded author, Oscar Guardiola Rivera. He is a Colombian. He teaches at international law and international affairs at the Birkbeck College, University of London. But he is particularly well regarded for his books on Latin America. And one of his most discussed and most appreciated books is on the coup against Salvador Allende, the president of Chile. The book is called Story of a Death Foretold. And while Pratik here is, one could say, digs out the truth on day-to-day news, contemporary history, Oscar has constantly looked at the facts about and given us the truth of the facts from the history of much that has happened in South America. Welcome to Kolkata. I believe it is your first trip here.
Not my first to India, but it is my first to Kolkata.
To Kolkata.
And I'll be coming back. You have to make sure they invite me again. I'm in love with this place.
Right. So let me begin by asking Pratik a question. So you are bringing us these, the truth of the fact of what is so fake among the news that we read. But the surge of fake news has not really subsided. How do you think the news media is reacting to the fact, which is now an established fact, that fake news is flooding us and sort of distracting us from the questions most important to our democracy?
I think news media is part of the cycle of producing misinformation. Definitely in India, it is part of the cycle of producing disinformation every single day. Whether it is TV channels or digital media, online media, and there are all kinds of online media now. They are producing disinformation at an astronomical scale. So news media is definitely a part of the issue, and it is not just coincidental that they're producing misinformation. It is organized in a way. So every time there is some breaking news event, let's say whether it is the Ukraine-Russia war where Indian students were stuck in Ukraine, or the CNRC, etc., every single time what we see from the alt news vantage point is that there is misinformation on social media, and then some of that is picked up by mainstream media and propagated further. Secondly, what we also see in mainstream media is that not only are they not involved in not debunking the misinformation, furthering the misinformation, but there's also extreme selectivity of news, especially in TV channels. I can't say it is not the equivalent in newspapers, but especially in TV channels, there's extreme selectivity of news. So for example, when a case like Shraddha Walker case happens, then for 15 days, they only show one specific news at 9 p.m. and that is because the accused is Muslim, and that is why they'll show only that for 15 days. So at this point in mainstream media is completely aligning with the government in power and is is part of the propaganda cycle.
And you think that this propaganda, I mean, those of us who work in news media, it seems to us about that the propaganda is almost like a weapon that is being used to keep people in the dark, rather than exposing the truth to us.
But that is the very purpose of propaganda, right? The very purpose of propaganda is to ensure that people don't think about their actual needs. The very purpose of showing, it was a gruesome murder, but showing that for 15 days straight is to ensure that people are only focusing on this one issue, that is, how to generate hate against the Muslim community. And they are not focusing on other issues, whether it is price rise, inflation, etc. So the very purpose of propaganda is to hide the truth, is to ensure that people don't think about their immediate needs.
So it is a corollary of a very undemocratic kind of politics.
Definitely.
Do you see that this kind of media propaganda, as you say, the media being extremely selective, the media actively becoming a voice of parties in power, that is already impacting our politics?
It is definitely impacting our politics. If you, not only it's impacting our politics, it is impacting people, it is actually causing violence on the ground, which is the most dangerous and which is the most worrying. So, for example, when the whole Tablighi Jamaat incident happened, and indirectly the Muslim population of India was accused that they are willingly spreading COVID, then, and mainstream media took part in that because they did not want to talk about the migrant workers crisis, which happened at the same point in time. And that is why, again, there was selectivity in news cycle. And then what we saw on the ground is Muslim vegetable vendors being attacked, because that was the only focus, Muslim vegetable vendors being attacked. We did a story in Alt News where in Gujarat, this one person, he had a handicap and he goes to a petrol pump and he's pulling out some cash from his pocket to pay for the petrol, and a note drops, and the owner of the petrol pump takes the CCTV, gives it to police, saying that this person has willingly dropped a note so as to spread COVID. And for the next 24 hours, I mean, he was detained for the next 24 hours, and eventually they let them go. So because of the selectivity of news, and selectivity of news which is leading to extreme hate and prejudice in the society, what we are seeing is that people on the ground are facing the brunt of it. And if that itself is the decay of democracy, when a common citizen is facing the brunt of what is happening on the political side.
And what is your idea, Pratik, that Indian media has had a long history? I mean, since independence, we have had a decently free media, one would like to believe. The question of freedom of media has always been a fraught issue. But this rise of fake news, it becoming a point of crisis, almost tipping the scales. How would you time this? What is the timeline? When did you think this started happening?
The timeline is approximately, I mean, the point when it got weaponized, organized, was after the introduction of Geo, around November 2016, when everybody got 2 GB of data, and it became easy to access videos and images. It became easy to access rich multimedia. And that is when our phones were flooded with all sorts of propaganda and small clips of news channels flooding everywhere. So I think that was the tipping point. In terms of social media, I have been working on the issue of misinformation since about 2013, prior to 2014 elections. But back then, for example, before the 2014 elections, everybody was talking about the Gujarat model. And then there was this one picture of a bus which was viral, claiming that this is the bus stand in Ahmedabad. I am from Ahmedabad, and I know that is not a bus stand in Ahmedabad. But at that point of time, the misinformation was very limited. Some images going around. But in 2019 elections, it was completely different. It was hugely driven by social media propaganda. And when you put something on social media, it literally takes seconds to go from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. So That is how powerful it is. But for me, the tipping point was when Geo was introduced in November 2016.
So Pratik ties this rise in fake news to introduction of new technologies, and that is how many of us do look at the power of social media. But Oscar, you're right.
I'm still here.
Yes, you're right that there is a long history of this, right? And propaganda has been used as a weapon against democratically elected governments for a long time, and you have recorded how that has happened in South America.
The history is very long indeed. In fact, you might say that Plato in Republic, when he tells the story about the cave and how people are looking at shadows and they confuse shadows with truth, well, you might say that he was already talking about the problems with untruth, propaganda, or doxa, opinion, which is what we are being flooded with, opinion. And if I'm allowed to put my philosopher's hat for a second, the very rise of philosophy, political philosophy in particular, is this struggle against opinion, against doxa, against opinionators, against those who would like us to think that they know and know better than the rest of us. Of course, when that illusion prevails, we remain silent. We allow for untruth to take over. And whenever I'm asked about these things, I tend to go for the poets. Not just the philosophers, but also the poets. Because the poets are the legislators of the world precisely in the sense that they play with and defend an inquiry into the nature of language, which is what allows us to communicate with each other. So let me answer the question by means of a quote from a poet, none other than Javid Akhtar, who is one of your brightest and most celebrated poets. He has this to say: all objects, each emotion, every thought, and all those sounds that successfully introduce them, give their news, spread their every message, and the twisted lines that host the sounds that protect them. Who has put together this clan? It's a beautiful question. And the answer to that question forces itself to come out of your soul like lava, like an explosion. And the answer is, of course, all of us, all together. We are the ones who put together these things, the sounds, the objects, the ideas. And that is the very basis of democracy. Mukulike Banerjee was referring to that a few days ago when she reminded us that Gantatra, the Hindi word that is used to speak of democracy, has as its root precisely this idea of gathering together, of the things that we make together. If we remind ourselves that we make all these things together, that we together are the soul of democracy, and we begin to converse with each other, to ask each other the questions, to perform the rituals that we are performing here on stage, which should be performed and part of everyday life, then we build a stronghold that those who would like to thrive on fakery, on opinion, on untruth, cannot boost, cannot go against. And that's what we need. There is a long history of this, as I said. And in Latin America, where I come from, the animation of the people, particularly the women, for instance, the women who are right now at the entrance of Lima in Peru, struggling to recover the constitution that has been taken from them. When they are doing that, they are reminding us that democracy stays alive at a cost, that we need to fight for it. And the way we fight for it is precisely by making common spaces, by creating these spaces of togetherness. If we keep talking to each other, not just in this city, in this nation, but across all nations, as we used to do when Latin Americans and Southeast Asians spoke together and formed an alliance called the Tricontinental back in the 1960s and 1970s, then those who would like to tyrannize us cannot do so. So the message is very simple. Let us continue the conversation. Let us remind ourselves of our common history. We Latin Americans and you Southeast Asians have a common history. Salvador Allende, the president of Chile in 1971, could not have nationalized copper in Chile if not because he came together with Indira Gandhi and others in other parts of the world and spoke before the UN General Assembly to tell them that another economy needed to be possible. Those words are more relevant now than they were 40 or 50 years ago. Because it is now, with the introduction of these new technologies, that we ourselves, our very soul, have become the point of extraction for those who, using their algorithms and their derivatives in financial systems, only think about gathering more and more profit. And those are the ones who finance the Bolsonaros and the Trumps and the Modis of this world. So if we want to make ourselves strong against such tyrants, we need to retake control of our history, of our memory, of our meaning-making means, our sense-making means. We're all diverse, we're all different, but we can gather if we have a common orientation, the one we give ourselves when we speak, when we act together, and when we build newer spaces for common, for living in common, and for commons. That's the antidote against fakery, and that's the fail-safe against those who would like to use democracy against itself.
Right. I mean, that's what you just said to us is wonderful, but I was very struck by a certain passage in your book where you say that this collective deliberation, whose importance cannot be overstated, as you are saying, these collective deliberations are not just useful for preserving democracy, they also have a revolutionary impact on people's consciousness. So I will just read out this passage in the book Story of a Death Foretold. In referring to the judgment of history, we endeavor in imagination to conceive of a better future that would replace the current order and attempt to realize it in the present. As in reality, there is always scope for incompleteness and failure. The practical lesson we draw is that we struggle and protest because not to do so would be too humiliating, too deadly, too inhuman. We protest by defending ourselves in unjust court proceedings, building a barricade, taking up arms, going on hunger strike, shouting, speaking up, or writing in order to save the present moment, come what may, so that there may be a future. You were writing more than a decade ago. This book came out in 2013, I think, and you just said that you have researched for a long time before that, and you took almost 3 years just to write the book. And you were writing about people who were trying to change things in 60s and 70s. So these were politicians who were trying to redefine themselves rather than be defined by imperial or colonial forces, by fascist regimes. So in this struggle, this future that they were imagining then, is it the same dream that we have now? Has anything changed in between?
Plenty has changed, but it is very important to know that in the midst of those changes, some struggles remain the same. We have a saying in Latin America, and I think it has various resonances with similar proverbs elsewhere in the world. It comes from our indigenous tradition, so it comes from before colonial times. Move backwards, look forwards. Always move backwards so that you can find the tools with which you can struggle in the present in the interrupted projects of the past. For instance, in the last speech that Salvador Allende gave, the last public speech, through a telephone, while bombs were falling upon Palacio de la Moneda in Santiago de Chile, he communicated to the citizens of Chile a vision of a better future. The time will come, he said, when men and women, the common men and women of this country, will walk free once again in the great malls of the capital. Well, that time, he said that in 1973, when his dream, the Chilean way, a form of democratic, non-violent socialism, was falling. That message was taken up by a newer generation 40 or 50 years later. It is not a coincidence that the current president of Chile, Mr. Pratik, is a member of the student movement who, almost a decade ago, began to find their own ways to connect with their own history, because their parents did not want to tell their story to them. If they were right-wing parents, because they did not want their kids to be contaminated, inverted commas, with socialism or communism. If they were left-wing, because they wouldn't want them to risk the sufferings they went through. As a result of that, at least 2 generations of Chileans went on without knowing their immediate past. But of course, very quickly you realize that your immediate past is your biography. The part of your biography that hasn't been told to you, your roots. That's what it means to look for roots, to be radical. And so what did they do? They went on to find evidence, facts, narrations for the story that had not been told to them. That the fascists of the time, Pinochet, and the civilians who still benefit from what happened in 1973 wanted to erase. And they did that work. And in doing that work, something marvelous happened to them. They changed. They realized that they themselves had to create the space in which they could have a different life. That was the dream of the 1970s. This is the dream right now in 2022. The new Chilean constitution, which was put together mostly by the leadership of indigenous women from the South, who have been traditionally excluded from politics, not only in Latin America, but pretty much everywhere else in the modern world, that constitution embodies that promise and gives the citizens the tools with which to do so. It was such a game changer that the forces still in power, the post-fascists, who are the ones who profit from fake news, they used a barrage of fake news to scare most of the population, and the population, in fear, voted against the project for the Constitution. Which means that the thing we need to do away, to rid ourselves of, is fear. And the thing that we need to hold on to is the fire of anger that allows us to produce hope. What is hope? The vision of a newer future. In Latin America, every single revolution, every single act of resistance, beginning in the 16th century against the colonizers, all the way through to the 21st century, because the struggle is still there, is led by visionaries. Among indigenous peoples, they're known as prophets. What they do is they conjure up a vision of a different future. but then they return. It's not just escape into the imagination. What matters is the journey back into the here and now. Once you have a vision of a different future, you can use it as a yardstick with which to measure what is lacking here and now. The distance between what is lacking here and now in the present and that possible future is what we call justice. And the work, the real work, starts then, to realize justice here and now, not in the future, not in another world, not in another time, but here, and to do so together. That was the message coming from our indigenous traditions, and this is the message that the newer generation, the digital natives of the Americas, not just Latin America. Remember 2021, the cycle of protests that rocked the world. BLM in the United States and elsewhere, protests in Chile, a general strike in Colombia. Well, now, all those things, those acts of protest have culminated in the organization of what we should call dual power, double power. Streets containing and communicating these older traditions with which to create republics, and the ballot box. A horizontal movement and a vertical political flight. In operationalizing that dual power, these young movements, these movements led mostly by women, mostly by peasant women, allowed for the triumph in 2022 of Gustavo Petro in Colombia, and now against Bolsonaro, by the threads of our fingernails, of Lula da Silva against the neo-fascists and the Bolsonaristas. They will keep reacting. They will keep disguising with their horns. They will keep selling to us their fake news. They will keep telling us that we should be fighting against each other. This identity against that identity, this caste against the other caste, this group against the other group. They want to divide us so they can keep ruling us. What we must do is very simple. Use the tools of the street and the ballot box to gather together again. Once we gather together, project an idea of a better future, use that as a joystick, because there is so much that is lacking in this present, in which we are being, our very souls are being extracted from us, and then run with that idea to the ballot box and tell all the tyrants that it's time for them to leave, to go away.
And I think that one of the things which really drives all these protests on the street and forces people to rethink, you have very eloquently expressed throughout this book as the contradiction which is at the heart of modern democracy, which is between the contradiction between liberty and slavery, which coexist almost as conditions for each other in modern democracy. And when I saw the theme of this discussion here, that does democracy have all the answers? So I was thinking that this is perhaps something that, that answer which democracy doesn't seem to have appeared yet. A democracy which is driven so much by corporates and governments which are very close to corporate interests.
The predominance of newer forms of capitalism is something that we need to understand better. Perhaps those of us who engage with political philosophy have wasted too much time trying to figure out the right conditions under which democracy or equality might flourish. But I have good news. Our political ideas about democracy are undergoing a true revolution. And that revolution is not being led by the philosophers or those who, disguising themselves as philosophers, appear in front of the cameras as experts trying to tell us that they know better than us. Rather, it is being driven by peasant and female-led movements on the ground and the anthropologists who are their interlocutors. And after this session, you're going to listen to two of them, two of the most brilliant ones alive right now, Murkulike Banerjee and David Wengrow. And David Wengrow and his co-author in the book that you're going to hear about tell us the story, the longer story of liberty. And they are asking us to differentiate liberty from mere procedural equality, which is what those who rule us under the appearance of democracy hide themselves behind in order to tell that we still live in democracies. But as you put it correctly, if our democracies are being led by corporations, mostly by financial corporations, as this is the most important change in between the 1970s and now, financial corporations who use your pain, your suffering, and crisis to profit, because they have now invented the tools with which they can profit from crisis and catastrophe. You have heard that term, never let a good crisis to waste. Boy, we know it in Great Britain, because those who rule us right now in Great Britain are just producing crisis after crisis so that their friends who fund their parties, who put them in 10 Downing Street, can benefit from those. So we need to understand much better how is it that those tools that profit from catastrophe work. At the same time, as we learn from the anthropologists and their native and peasant interlocutors, how is it that you keep the soul of democracy alive? The battle is the battle between liberty and slavery slavery is always a slavery of the soul, not just the body. Because actually those who rule us would like to have our bodies. They would like to use us as they use a robot or a slave which they have dehumanized by pretending he or she has no consciousness and no soul. There are newer forms of slavery. When you are interacting with your digital platform, you no longer see who is watching you. The algorithm is capturing your information, is bundling that information and selling it. We must learn how those tools work. We must engage with them, not refuse them. We must engage with them and harness their power towards democratic and republican means. That can be done, that needs to be done. That's the task for those of us who write poetry, who write novels, who write ethnographies, who write philosophy. Because right now we are in a situation, before these capitalist corporations, these financial corporations, we are in a situation that is not very different from that in which lay men and women found themselves in the late medieval ages in Europe. When priests speak in Latin that nobody else understands, show their backs to them, and use all manner of smoke and mirrors to pretend that they have a direct connection with God, lay people begin to think that they must know better. And they begin to identify with them. And they begin to do as these pretend leaders tell them to do. You see, that is not very different from what the Trumps and the Bolsonaros of this world do. They appear to us as if they were metahuman. They appear as if they could get away with everything, with rape, with assassination, even with genocide. So, of course, people begin to think they must be supernatural. They must be metahumans. We need to recover a sense of our own humanity precisely against those wannabe kingly figures. And how we do that? By cultivating truth among us. By cultivating truth via poetry, via the news, in festivals such as these are the rituals of democracy. And democracy dies when those rituals also die. So therein lies also the power of social media. Newer generations are harnessing the power to be together and build spaces of togetherness in that digital world. If you then allow those common spaces to bleed into the streets of the real world, you have the ingredients for that wonderful dish, which is a Republican democracy.
Thanks, Oscar. And I think that, Pratik, you are already engaging in this new kind of engagement that is required, the new kind of education that we need in order to actually use the social media, the newer forms of media that we have, to cultivate better democracy.
So what we're doing as an organization, what we did for the past 5-6 years is look at mainstream media, look at social media, and figure out what narratives are being built, where misinformation is being used to build those narratives, and we kept writing about it. But eventually, I think about 2-3 years down the line, we realized that that is not enough. Whatever work we are doing, that is having very limited impact. It was having some impact. For example, sometime in Lucknow, it was claimed that there was a Pakistan Zindabad slogan in some AIMM rally, and we wrote a story. And next day, at least 2 people from mainstream media sent me WhatsApp messages saying that our editor had asked us to take up the story, but because we saw your story come out late in the night, we dropped the story. So in those limited ways, we were making some impact in the mainstream media, as in we were calling them out, so they were being more careful, they were pulling down some stories. But by and large, not much was happening. And in terms of people believing the popular narrative, that is continuing to happen. So at this point of time, we will continue to do what we're doing, but what we're doing new is we are starting to go to schools, we are starting to look at what children are learning and what children are watching, and trying to see if we can teach the children how to look at information. Because I do strongly believe that the political parties in India have a very short-term vision, and people who are working in the civil society, they need to have a longer vision. It should not only be about the next election or losing or winning the next election. It should be a longer vision which can eventually probably strengthen a democracy. So what I strongly believe, looking at how how people are consuming information, that there's an urgent need to teach people how to consume information, how to look at information, and especially start at a younger age, so that the next generation knows what is propaganda, what is not propaganda, and hopefully that will lead to strengthening of the democracy.
So to look critically at what is being offered to them. We have another 5 minutes, so if anybody in the audience has a question.
Thank you. Hello, Sir Oscar. Sir, I have a question for you. From riot to writing, where do you, as a writer, draw a line from noise, interference, and music to create, especially living in the time of polyglottic babblings of media? And where do you place Mario Vargas Llosa's A Feast of Goat in noise, interference, or something else? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Can we have 1 or 2 questions? Yeah.
Hi, to both of you. I would like to bring the question back to the matter of doxa that you talked about. So when we are speaking about opinion in democracy and going to the category of truth itself, when the category of truth itself is in crisis, when people are not interested in truth. If I remember correctly, from whenever I go on social media and I look at the alt news page and the comment section, I see more trolling than anything else. So people are not interested in truth itself, which is one of the foundations upon which you can have the rational conversations which are supposed to bring people together under democracy. What does it mean to even go forward with it? Because that was one of the fundamental questions of this panel, that what what is the answer of democracy? So if truth is in crisis itself, if people don't want to believe, and if we cannot raise a counter-hegemony to the one that exists.
Right. I think you have made yourself clear. So the young lady and then Shukantoda. Okay. Oh, sorry. Just a minute. Yeah.
I'll take the young lady.
Thank you. My
Shamelessly.
question-
Okay, so sorry.
Oh, thank you. My question is to Oscar, sir. I attended one of his last sessions and I find you immensely politically aware. So my question to you is, do you think that online activism in e-democracy is a poignant tool for bringing about new political order? Because when online activism and e-democracy exists, the government is also seen clamping down on people trying to raise their voice. So do you see that, do you see people using that, being able to use that as a useful tool to bring about a new political order? Thank you.
Just two more questions, Shukantoda and the lady
Hi,
here.
I've been wanting to ask. My question is both to you, Pratik, and Oscar. Pratik, I follow alt news like many people do. You're probably aware of this. We have this concept of bots that troll us. So if there's an unpopular news article published, perhaps there'll be 1,000 identical messages under different names. Maybe at the stroke of one keyboard or two, sent to counter that particular unpalatable piece of news, or to silence people. And I'm sorry to say it, but it's actually quite effective. It does manage to silence people. And similarly, with EVMs, there is a certain lack of transparency. I mean, in the days of physical voting, we actually saw booth capturing. We knew it was happening. But with EVMs, it's getting harder and harder to actually find out where the truth lies. And it seems more and more the technology is this tool that we can't quite understand. And it kind of is one of the biggest threats to democracy as it stands. Probably, yes, our online habits are bad enough, but tech itself is probably a threat. And I'd really like you to comment on it, or if there's any way to circumvent this.
So, answer to both questions about trolling. The assumption that people are not interested in truth, I don't think that is the correct assumption. Because trolling is an evidence that why does trolling happen? As in, for example, why does alt news in specific gets trolled? And the reason for that is because people are reading alt news. And because people are reading alt news, there's a need to generate a counter narrative. So that is when you see number of comments to alt news, in response to alt news posts. So people are interested in truth. And when does trolling happen more? For example, somebody on social media, typically when somebody comes out with a personal narrative that this is what has happened to me, then that is when that individual is trolled. So the individuals who are being trolled, the organizations who are being trolled, but more in the trolling is happening because they are bringing something original or something which the regime fears is going to change the narrative again. So in my opinion, whatever trolling we as an organization face is primarily because people are reading us and they want to ensure that people don't read us. So I think the assumption that people are not interested in truth is not true. And that itself should propel us forward to do more such things. I mean, we're doing it in English and Hindi, but where is the equivalent in Bangla? Where is the equivalent in Omia? Where is the equivalent in other languages? And where are we teaching people how to look at information in different languages? So I think we should go forward with the assumption that people are interested in truth and then invest in a way that more and more people can figure out what the truth is.
Very, very briefly, musicians and poetry performers know that when you produce music, you almost always do so taking into account the space, the venue where you are. Noise comes into that picture as the reverb of that one place produces, and if the place is not a good acoustic venue, you have to use other technologies, other instruments in other ways. So the way to draw the line between noise and writing, between untruth and truth, has to do with the better use you can do of your newer technologies. E-activism works precisely because of that. The fact, as we were hearing just before, that governments are trying so hard to clamp down and listen, and the problems they have to distinguish between noise and messages that effectively address political issues are a demonstration that e-activism and those new tools could be harnessed and used in better ways. Many of us have witnessed that. For instance, during the 2021 general strike in Colombia, those of us who were out of the country linked up in real time to the phone cameras of those who were in the first line of the protest, thereby recording instantly the abuses of the police and the repression of the Duque government. And immediately we send those videos to several media outlets, be it The Guardian or the New York Times or an alternative news outlet in Great Britain called Novara Media. Because of that, the government of Colombia, the then fascist government of Colombia, was not allowed to control the narrative. And because of that, when they came to try and tell the world that they were being democratic and that repression was not happening, their story had already been preempted. This is what I meant when I said, this is a practical example of what I meant when I said that we must harness the power of technologies and not just digital but also derivative technologies in order to reorient them towards better means. Very good writers, very briefly, like Mario Vargas Llosa, have forgotten that. Mario Vargas Llosa is an excellent writer. He's a terrible political thinker and a terrible political philosopher. And we should not confuse the two. The Feast of the Goat is still a great novel and will continue to be a great novel. But his political opinions are confusing, and look at what is happening in Peru, and he hasn't said a word. Well, maybe we shouldn't listen to people like that. Maybe we should listen to the peasant women who are putting their bodies where their soul and where their democracy is. That is how we save our democracies.
Perhaps a last comment from Professor Shukanta Chaudhary.
Thank you very much. It's almost embarrassing to this. But I had a question for Rivera. I mean, you talked, and what you just said, and earlier, this very inspiring way, this very rousing way about movements rising from common people, from the women, from the farmers, which can take on global capital, global power. It's fine. But are you in some danger of skirting one of the most disturbing features that's appearing in country after country today, which is that people who are undoubtedly common people, even underprivileged people, poor people, they are in fact coming out on the side of far-right politics. At one level in violence, like what happened in the Capitol in Washington, or what has just happened, been done by the Bolsonaristi, or in a quieter way, by a quiet the spreading of highly reactionary actors to broad sections, very humble people. So, this ironical situation now that the populism is coming to be associated with far right rather than left politics. Would you like to comment on that? Where the danger of this lies and how it might be countered?
Very quickly, I'll just say this.
Yes, because we are out of time,
We are out
so
of time.
please.
So I'll just say this. The very function of fascist parties is to divide the people against itself. That has always been the function of fascist or post-fascistic parties. And once they do that, they guarantee that those who rule, who often take a distance from those fascist movements, continue to rule. It is not a coincidence that fascist movements are very quickly reabsorbed in more stable, let's use that word, conservative parties and conservative forces. But let us also remember that fascism flourished only there where the left imagination, the anarchist imagination, the popular, not populist imagination has been caged in, controlled, and imprisoned. That is why we need to free our imagination again. We cannot do that on our own, and we cannot do that solely by looking at tweets on our screen. We need to gather. We need to go out there. We need to allow our private or semi-private conversations to bleed into the street. That is how we can save democracy. If that doesn't happen, of course the fascists will continue to thrive. Finally, we need to recover the poetic tradition of revolt. Why? Because those poets were the first ones who were able to diagnose in the 1910s and 1920s why fascism was on the rise. One of them, Pierre Jouyot, spoke of a psychological misery associated to, but different from, the economic poverty that capitalism was producing. This psychological misery was a kind of self-hatred that had to do with the fact that on top of being poor, you could see that those who were wealthy could get away with everything and break every single moral and ethical constraint. So no wonder you begin to think, being poor, oh, I want to be like them so I can also get away with everything. In fact, Frantz Fanon speaks about that in one of his famous chapters in Les Damnés de la Terre, when he warns the black liberations movements of the time in Africa and in the Americas that it wasn't enough to just occupy the house of the master, because you were at risk of becoming the master. That has happened in Latin America. The Bolsonaros and the Uribe Vélez and so on, well, those guys are subservient to other powers. They want to identify with them. They hate themselves. And that's why they so hate everywhere else. How can we stop them? How can we turn in a different direction? Precisely by allowing our imagination and our political actions to be free again. For the young people in the audience, to remember that political action is fun. It is really fun. When you're out there, when you're struggling, when you're together with others, you make friendships that you never thought possible, across class, across identity, across sexual divisions. And that changes you. And then there is no way back. Frantz Fanon had a beautiful term for that, radical mutation. Identity is not fixed, it changes. It is divided from within. And that is the basis of our hope today.
On that very hopeful note, we end this session. I thank both our panelists, Pratik, Oscar, thank you so much for your comments. And thanks for an audience which is really engaged very actively. Thank you all.
Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful and masterful set of questions. And thank you all. You're an amazing audience. I want to stay here. I don't know anything, but I've been learning so much from you all in these 4 days that I would only want to shut up and listen to you. Thank you.